History portrays Edward VI as the weak and ultimately doomed son of Henry VII, but the truth is much darker. Even as a boy, Edward proved to be almost as twisted as his obese father, and his horrible end was probably a blessing for England. Don't believe us? Take the plunge and find out for yourself. The birth of Edward VI was probably the greatest moment in Henry VII's life. The obese king desperately wanted a son, but it took 28 years, 2 daughters and 3 wives to finally make it happen. To say people were excited would be an understatement. One chronicler described baby Edward as the most beautiful boy they had ever seen. England, however, could not celebrate for long. Tragedy soon overshadowed the joyous occasion. Queen Jane Seymour could not participate in the celebrations with everyone else. It soon became clear that childbirth had taken a heavy toll on her. Within days, she was hanging by a thread. Seymour struggled for just over a week before succumbing to her illness. Edward VI never met his mother. And let's just say the boy definitely needed all the maternal guidance he could get. Edward VI grew up without a mother. But here's the thing. He basically grew up without a father as well. Sure, Henry VII was beyond thrilled to finally have a son, but that doesn't mean he was really going to spend time with the boy. Henry sent Edward away almost from the moment he was born, and except for one brief visit when Edward was a year old, he hardly ever saw the boy for the first few years of his life. Which means that Henry was not there to support Edward when the boy was fighting for his life. Most reports claim that Edward VI was a healthy and robust child, but this could have just been a ruse to avoid Henry VIII's anger at being given bad news about his boy. Either way, there is one thing we know for sure. When Edward was 4 years old, he contracted a fatal 4-day fever. I'm sure all of England held its breath. Who knows how gloomy Henry VII would have become if the son he had waited so many years for had suddenly passed away. But Edward eventually recovered and grew up to be one of the most spoiled brats the world has ever seen. Sure, Henry didn't really spend any time with Edward, but he spoiled the hell out of the kid anyway. He called his son the most precious jewel of this whole kingdom, and he made his servants treat him accordingly. Edward VI's whole life changed when he turned 6 years old. Why? Because, believe it or not, the Tudors believed a child became an adult at 6. You heard right. This meant that Edward was finally able to move in with his happy father, and their relationship quickly took a strange turn. He completely remodeled Edward's rooms to look exactly like his own. Henry also replaced Edward's entire closet with smaller versions of his own clothes. I suppose Henry hoped that with the same rooms and the same clothes, Edward would turn out just like him. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Edward turned out to be just as spoiled as Henry. Sure, Henry made Edward study like any other boy, but he made sure that his son studied in style. Edward's school books were completely covered in gold and decorated with sapphires, rubies, and diamonds. And when Edward had lunch breaks, he ate with cutlery, inlaid with precious stones, and napkins stitched with pure gold and silver threads. And like many rich children, Edward had disturbing hobbies. Edward had plenty to do, intense studies as well as the manly fencing and horseback riding that Henry insisted on. But in between all of this, Edward still found time to engage in a dark pastime: witchcraft. Among Edward's mountains of toys, he kept a sinister red box filled with the tools of sorcery. He and his older sister Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, had a strange obsession with magic and astrology. But while Edward and Elizabeth loved to cast spells together, it was nothing compared to Edward's relationship with his other sister, the infamous Bloody Mary. Edward absolutely adored his older sister Mary, once writing, "I love you most," when he was 9 years old. It makes sense. Mary was 2 decades older than him, and with no mother and an absent father, she was the closest thing Edward had to a parental figure. But like his father, Edward's moods could change quickly, and soon Edward and Bloody Mary were sworn enemies. Give Edward VI credit for one thing. He was the only man on earth who seemed to be able to make Henry VII behave like a decent human being. Henry had long since disinherited both his daughters, divorced and beheaded their mothers, but the birth of his son softened him. In 1543, he invited all 3 of his children to spend Christmas with him. This seems quite normal for most families, but for the Tudors, it was completely unheard of. This pleasant Christmas dinner took place at the high point of Henry VII's life. Not only was his son everything he had dreamed of, but Edward even solved one of Henry's biggest problems. Henry made a deal with Scotland for Edward to marry 7-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots. With this deal, Henry set himself up to finally bring Scotland under English rule after centuries of conflict. Ironically, around the time Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth were enjoying their Christmas dinner together, the Scots reneged on their marriage contract. To say that Henry was furious is an understatement. He became furious and sent Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, north to teach the Scots a lesson. His instructions were absolutely terrifying. Henry VII ordered Seymour to consign all things to fire and sword, burn Edinburgh, that when you have plundered and gotten all you can, it may remain forever an everlasting memory of God's vengeance upon them for their lies and infidelity. Seymour glorified Henry and launched an utterly brutal campaign in Scotland. Henry VII created his own religion just to get a divorce, and he made sure to brainwash his son about his new faith. At just 12 years old, Edward was a complete religious fanatic. He even wrote a treatise saying that the Pope was the very son of the devil himself, an antichrist and a vile tyrant. Whether anyone thought Edward would make a good king doesn't change the facts. Henry VII died in 1547, and the 9-year-old Edward became king. After the absolute circus of Henry's reign, no doubt the people of England were hoping they could finally catch a break. Edward's reign would be as chaotic as his father's. But don't worry, it would be interrupted before Edward could do too much damage. Even as a boy, Edward VI had a violent streak. He was his father's son, after all. Remember how Henry made sure to brainwash Edward in the new Anglican Church? By the time he became king, Edward was a full-blown bigot, and he spent most of his time rewriting the laws of England so that Catholics would be severely oppressed. But although suppressing the Catholics was one of the top things on Edward's list, he couldn't do everything himself. He had advisors who did most of the ruling for him, but these men were as power-hungry and heartless as his father. One man dominated most of Edward's reign, his uncle Edward Seymour. This was the same guy Henry VII sent north to ravage Scotland. Ever since his sister Jane married Henry VII, Seymour had his eye on power, and now it was in his hands. When his nephew became king, Seymour quickly proved that he would do anything to increase his influence. As soon as Henry died, Seymour began bribing everyone at court. The bribery worked, and Seymour became Lord Protector of England within days, and he set about ruling the country with an iron fist. There was one man who stood between Edward Seymour and the power he craved his own brother Thomas. Edward paid off the king's other advisors, but Thomas went straight to the king. Thomas began whispering in young Edward VI's ear, secretly giving him money and claiming that his brother was bent on making a beggar of him. But poisoning Edward VI's mind was only the first part of Thomas Seymour's plan to gain power. The next part was even darker. Thomas Seymour devised a plot that would completely change the course of history. In the chaos following the death of Henry VIII, Seymour planned to marry Princess Elizabeth, then kidnap Edward VI, and force him to abdicate in favor of his sister, effectively making Thomas Seymour King of England. Honestly, it was a pretty good plan, but the night he tried to pull it all off, it all went horribly wrong. One night, the guards caught Thomas Seymour trying to sneak into the room of the new King Edward VI. He was trying to sneak in unnoticed, but a dog spotted Seymour and started barking. In an equally cruel and idiotic act, Seymour silenced the dog by shooting it. If the barking didn't attract the guards' attention, the shots definitely did. They quickly pounced on Seymour and sent him to the tower. By this point, Thomas Seymour was completely and utterly doomed. He probably hoped that his brother would save him, but he didn't realize how heartless Edward Seymour was. Edward Seymour's heart was made of ice. He didn't even flinch when he ordered his brother's execution for treason and tightened his grip on the king. For the next few years, Seymour did his best to distract King Edward VI, while he ran England into the ground with almost unlimited power. However, Seymour had made countless enemies as King of Kings, and it was only a matter of time before someone came for his head. The longer Edward Seymour held power, the more arrogant and careless he became. Finally, in 1549, he stumbled. Seymour's former ally, John Dudley, convinced King Edward VI that Seymour planned to usurp his power, and that was enough. Seymour was subsequently executed for treason, and Dudley took over as Lord Protector. Edward Seymour is a black stain on the legacy of King Edward VI. Sure, it's unlikely that a child king could have done much to stop him, but Seymour threw England into chaos with his absolute fiasco of a reign. Things got a little better when the next guy, John Dudley, came to power, but let's not get crazy. Dudley was still a brutal tyrant who wielded absolute power by bullying the actual king, but at least he didn't screw up as badly and as often as Seymour did. Dudley even managed to find Edward VI a bride, though of course this love story was doomed from the start. England and France were almost constantly at war during the Middle Ages, and the same was true of Edward VI's reign. When Dudley took over as Lord Protector, the French continued to beat him on the battlefield. Dudley realized that he would quickly bankrupt England if he continued to fight, so he desperately looked for a way out. His salvation came in the form of a marriage contract. After all, Edward VI was already a full-fledged teenager. It was high time he had a wife. France forced John Dudley to sign one of the most humiliating peace treaties in English history. He had to withdraw his troops not only from French territory but also from Scotland, finally ending a conflict that had begun years earlier when the Scots rejected the marriage contract of Edward VI and Mary, Queen of Scots. To make the contract official, Dudley and the French king also arranged for Edward VI to marry Princess Elizabeth of Valois. God help poor Elizabeth if this marriage had ever taken place. But it didn't. Edward VI may have seemed healthy, but dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. It turns out that having a spoiled teenager as king isn't exactly ideal. Edward's advisors were too busy fighting each other for power to actually run the country, and England entered a dark era. By 1552, the country was in chaos, and the country was begging the king to rise up and restore order. But Edward VI could not be that king. Just as things were reaching a climax, Edward suffered a crushing blow. In April 1552, Edward VI contracted measles. The disease ravaged the young king's body, but after several agonizing weeks, he managed to recover. The crisis seemed to have passed, but the measles was only the beginning. He may not have realized it, but Edward's clock was ticking and there was more pain to come. Edward may have recovered from the measles, but the damage was done. The disease had completely compromised his immune system, so when the next illness came, Edward had nothing to fight off. It all started when Edward started coughing in January 1553. Then the fever started. What may have seemed like a passing flu quickly got worse and worse until the boy king became an alarming sight. Edward suffered excruciating pain for months, but by April he seemed to have recovered. By May, Edward seemed well enough for all of his royal physicians to believe that he had recovered. A few days later, Edward's cough returned with redoubled vigor, this time worse than ever before. Between the scorching fever and the racking coughs, Edward's once full body quickly began to exhaust itself. Soon his whole body was swollen like overripe fruit, and painful sores appeared on his skin. But though his body failed him, Edward VI's mind remained sharp. Knowing that his time was running out, Edward had only one thing on his mind: making sure his sisters never saw the throne. Edward had a close relationship with his sisters Mary and Elizabeth when he was a boy. This apparently soured as he grew up. The fact that Mary was Catholic explains why a fanatical Protestant like Edward might have turned against her. But what about his other sister, the very Protestant Elizabeth? Why did Edward suddenly decide that he hated Elizabeth as much as he hated Mary? Whatever the reason, in his last agonizing days, Edward did everything in his power to deprive his sisters of their primogeniture. Before Henry VII died, he announced that Mary and Elizabeth, respectively, were next in line to the throne after Edward VI. Now, Edward was a daddy's boy through and through, but apparently the years had changed him. Near the end, Edward shocked all of England by signing a last-minute proclamation against his father's wishes. This document completely disinherited his sisters and made a distant relative named Lady Jane Grey his rightful successor. Have you forgotten about John Dudley, the tyrant who ruled England behind the scenes? When Edward was barely clinging to life, Dudley realized he would never have a better chance to secure his power. He turned the ailing King Edward against his own sisters and convinced the boy king to disinherit them. And Lady Jane Grey? She turned out to be Dudley's own sister-in-law. Frankly, it all seemed like a pretty good plan, but Dudley was playing a dangerous game, and it cost him dearly in the end. On July 1st, 1553, Edward VI made his last public appearance. Crowds waited at his window to see their ailing king, but when he finally appeared, the audience was utterly shocked. Edward, who had always been so healthy and full of vigor, was completely exhausted. At that moment, the crowd realized what Edward's servants had probably known for weeks. Edward VI was at death's door. One day in early July, a weak Edward called one of his frightened servants to him and whispered a crushing confession, "I am glad to die." Fortunately, after 6 long months of struggle, Edward did not have to suffer much longer. King Edward VI was no more. He was only 15 years old. For some reason, it seemed too hard to believe that Edward had fallen so ill so suddenly. One day he was the epitome of health. The next day he was fading away. Skeptics pointed to a much darker cause of death: poison. Some claimed that John Dudley, a conniving tyrant who wanted power for himself, was behind it. Others pointed the finger at Catholics, or perhaps Edward's own sister Mary, whom Edward had persecuted so viciously. In fact, it is far more likely that Edward's end was tuberculosis or some such disease, but no one can ever say for sure. The important thing was that Edward was gone, and technically, Lady Jane Grey was now Queen of England. But not for long. Bloody Mary was Henry VII's own daughter. Lady Jane Grey was the granddaughter of Henry VII's sister. It didn't take a genealogy expert to figure out who had the greater claim to the throne. Mary quickly rallied thousands of supporters to her cause. With the people behind her, Mary turned the situation around for poor Jane Grey. Mary persuaded the Privy Council to permanently get rid of Lady Jane Grey, who became known as the Queen of 9 Days, and declare her Queen Mary of England. She subsequently threw Jane and her husband into the Tower and accused them both of treason. There, Jane rotted for the better part of a year before Mary finally decided to dispose of her. Mary ordered Jane Grey beheaded in February 1554, but in a way she was lucky. Mary's revenge on Jane's father-in-law, John Dudley, was much more swift and brutal. By the time Mary's men dragged Dudley back to London for execution, he had barely made it to the scaffold. The guards could barely contain the angry mob, who were out for the blood of the man who had tried to steal the throne. Apparently, the gods really did not want Henry VII to have a son. Queen Jane Seymour's labor was particularly brutal, probably because of Edward's position in the womb. Things became so risky that at one point doctors thought it might come down to a terrible choice: save the baby or save the queen. According to one report, when the attendants asked the king what he wanted to do, his response was utterly callous. "If you can't save both, at least let the child live," he said. The more you learn about Edward, the more you realize how lucky England was that he passed away so young. Somewhere between exchanging clothes with his father and gem-encrusted forks, Edward was a real tomboy. And like all spoiled brats, he had a violent temper. But most rich kids just throw tantrums and cry. Edward VI's rage was far more disturbing. According to one contemporary, during one fit of rage, Edward tore a live falcon into 4 pieces with his bare hands. Now imagine what such a man might have done as a full-fledged king. No, Edward was not some tragic, innocent figure, as history might suggest. The truth was much darker. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy uncovering the best stories in history, give us a like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main Fact On 8 page for more incredible facts about everything.